Well, today I am joined by Winkfield Twyman Jr. And Wink, you are a former law professor and co-author of a new book, Letters in Black and White, a new correspondence on race in America, which you authored with Jennifer Richmond of ILV. And I've spoken with Jennifer, and this is my first time getting to speak with you in person, but I'm so pleased to have the opportunity to talk with you today. Thanks for joining me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, so you have a very great background. Your background in law is really impressive, and you've come through your life in the way that you have, and you've had this experience of watching us talk about race. I guess over the years, probably somewhat differently, an evolving conversation around race, and
Probably
you mentioned
62 years of looking at
and you mentioned that you really have been enjoying writing on race recently.
Yes.
And so what has been your evolving understanding of this concept in American life, and what are your thoughts, and what brings you into this conversation now at this time?
Well, that's a great question, and thank you for asking it. And thank you for having me as a guest. It's interesting. I was born in Richmond, Virginia, in 1961, in the capital of the Confederacy. And for the first 8 years of my life, I lived in a world that was all Black, and I had no sense of race. Race was not on my radar screen. Uh, all the people who were most important in my life, my parents, grandma, uncles, aunts, cousins, we talked about many things, church, family, dreams, but never things that bore upon the topics we hear today in the public square, such as oppression, white privilege, marginalization, etc. Those words were alien to me as I was growing up in my all Black world. It was only when um, public schools desegregated in 1969, the fall, that I had a sense of race. I was the only Black kid in my formerly all white school. I think you may be able to relate to that. If I recall, Leslie, you may have been a minority in your grade school experience back in Texas. And so I remember this moment when race was first something I had to think about and address. My white classmates, who were probably coming from homes that were very bigoted and prejudiced in fall 1969 in Virginia, would call me all kind of slurs and names. And I didn't understand why. And it got to me. And so I remember one day, I was 8 years old, I just sat down on the playground and thought about it. Why are these people equating skin color with intelligence? I
Mhm.
mean, the most important people in my life, mom, dad, grandma, Aunt Juanita, my various uncles, cousins, we were all Black, all different shades of skin color from dark to light. Intelligence and character had no bearing on skin color. And I knew that from my experience in an all Black world. So I reached an epiphany, in a sense, on the road to Damascus. But I reached a sense that these people were dumb. They were just kind of stupid. They weren't very
Mhm.
intelligent.
Mhm.
And that realization at playground kind of fortified me for my grade school days ahead, and actually into adult life. The idea that it's the person that counts, not the skin color, because that really has no direct correlation or causation to anything of note. So that's how I kind of viewed race throughout grade school, college, law school, adult life, and it worked for me. I sometimes marvel at the things I see nowadays in the public square: structures, systems, interlocking schemes of oppression. Hey, I missed that movie. I can tell you that that was just not my experience. And I was someone who actually grew up in Richmond, Virginia. Um, but here's the thing. On April 21st, 2018, I was having a conversation with a family member. And this family member is very privileged, it's fair to say, comes from very educated parents, uh, educated grandparent, great grandparents, uh, accomplished ancestors dating back to 1790. So, if anything, objectively, this person, it may be in the top 1% of people on the globe in terms of opportunities. But this person said to me in a conversation, Blackness is oppression.
Mm,
Nothing else matters.
mm,
And the disconnect between those words, that way of understanding the world, and what I knew from my personal life uh, struck a discord for me. It didn't make sense. And so that prompted me to dive more deeply into this idea of race as it was currently understood and to write about it and resulted ultimately in the book, Letters in Black and White, which you referenced earlier. So, yeah, so I think it was the disconnect between what I knew
mhm.
and what this close person said to me that prompted me to want to dig deeper into what was going on.
Mm.
How's that for a story?
That's a great story. Yeah. Um, and it is really interesting. I have I when I was in graduate school and we were being taught this way of looking at race that was different than I'd ever encountered previously. I brought out because we sort of had joked about doing a mock session like the way that I was taught in my program. And so
Heal me, Leslie, heal me.
yeah, I know it is just so
Racism,
patently, it's so offensive. I can't quite bring
eternal
myself.
oppression be gone.
Yeah, yeah, it's stuff like and I pulled up my book,
Right, right,
this
right.
one on
Uh,
counseling the culturally diverse, where
yeah,
we were taught how Black identities develop and how white
sure.
identities develop.
Hmm.
And the thing is, I think that some people see themselves represented in this. I genuinely do.
Hmm.
And as I looked around the classroom at fellow graduate students who, mostly white people, mostly women, nodding along and really talking about their privilege and feeling like this was representing them. I wondered, am I going crazy? Because this seems really reductive and simplistic and, like you said, kind of stupid. But I realized that to some extent, it did represent some of their experiences as people who had grown up in the middle class in a mostly white area. They really did feel like they were encountering their racial identity, if you will, in the way that the book was describing. For me, it was really different. I didn't grow up like that. And I don't hold my experience up as some kind of exceptionalism. It's just that people have a variety of different experiences. I didn't grow up in an only white area, and I didn't have even the experience you describe of prior to 8 years old being surrounded by only people who were of the same racial background as yourself. That wasn't my experience either. When I was from birth till 3, I lived in a quadruplex, and the people across the hall were a Black family with a kid my same age. There's a bunch of pictures of us playing together. I think his name was Johnny. I don't remember him, but there's, clearly you can see my experience didn't have this mono-ethnic flavor
Right.
that critical race theory tells us people grow up with.
Nor
And
does mine.
nor, yeah,
Nor does mine.
no,
So,
and it seems so problematic to try to take aggregates of experience and then distill them down to something that represents the individual.
exactly. If there are over 40 million Black Americans, there are over 40 million stories, experiences, and perspectives. So it is true, perhaps, that there are some experiences that can roughly, uh, crudely be collapsed into an avatar
Mhm,
for a race. But one has to be mindful that ultimately people are humans before they are a race.
mhm,
And so if you look at people that way, you're tuned into, well, what's their particular experience in life, right? So, for example, when we began writing the book, Jennifer Richmond and I, one of the things that she said, and I recognized it from years of living and from media coverage, is she lamented how she felt she couldn't really understand Black Americans because she had no overlap with the experience of Ta-Nehisi Coates, who wrote Between the World and Me. And as you might recall, he was a writer born in 1975 in Baltimore, Maryland, who wrote a very dystopian view of the Black experience in America. And I said to Jennifer, it's same goes for me too. I grew up in a southern suburb, a small town. Uh, My grade school was 3.74% Black. My high school was 8%. I very much lived in middle America. But what's interesting is that, and Jennifer has a good heart and a good faith, because of the way we so live in caricatures and view Black Americans through stereotypes, she was primed to believe, well, Ta-Nehisi Coates has given me the word, the gospel
Mm,
on the Black experience. Not recognizing it's far smarter just to talk to Wink and see what Wink's story is. You shouldn't read Wink through the filter of Between the World and Me, because if you do, that's like being a crazy funhouse where the mirrors are all distorted and convoluted. Yeah.
yeah.
I actually don't like cities. I find cities a little bit what's the word? I don't want to go too extreme here, but I will say, obviously, that I'm most comfortable in small towns. I'm
Hmm.
most comfortable in mountain places.
Hmm.
Cities for me are different. They're not what I grew up knowing.
Hmm.
Now that's not true for all people, of course. My lovely wife, born and raised in Brooklyn, so of course I've had to adjust and accommodate myself to the urban experience. Same goes with my mother-in-law. But by and large, I mean, there are people for whom the small town, the suburb, that's kind of their template for life. And so they appreciate that many Black Americans may live in the city, but we kind of look at it from a distance.
Hmm.
It's not a lived experience we would internalize. And that's why I find that books like Between the World and Me, Ta-Nehisi Coates, and many diversity trainers and many dogmatists, they just get it wrong
Hmm.
because it's kind of intellectual laziness. There are all of these millions of Black people. I want to understand them. Give me something down, dirty, and cheap. Give me like an easy thing to grab onto. Blackness is oppression. Nothing else matters. There you
Yeah.
go.
Yeah.
Off the shelf.
Yeah. And I had that thought as well when I was being encountering this material for the first time, that there's this sense of almost a white hive mind that I'm supposed to be able to tap into
Mm,
somehow. There's this flattening of what it means to be,
yeah.
to look like a certain kind of person. You must think like a certain kind of person if you, and I find it so condescending. And
Mm,
the people that it's most condescending to are the people that it lifts up as marginalized, because it's really
mm,
infantilizing in some ways. I get that there's a spirit behind it of recognition
mm,
of difficulties that people have
mm.
experienced or do
Right.
experience. And I think
Yeah.
that there are conversations to be had around that and sensitivities that could be instilled around that. And yet I think, to my way of thinking, this is the wrong way to go about that.
Well, like, for example, Leslie, let's just say I was a client of yours and you were a life coach. And I was having issues, non-racial issues about, oh, let's say there's some family member from back home in Virginia who I just can't stand. And I think that family member would be a very poor influence in my household, or that family member to come to San Diego. And it causes me to lose sleep at night. I toss and turn. I share my fears with my wife. She doesn't think it's a big deal. I come to you because I can't be at peace until I can address this issue. How would you approach me? How would you counsel me about this deep issue of not wanting to have a family member move across the country and live in my home, because I think it would be disruptive due
Well,
to cultural differences.
no, well, I think first we just start by exploring what's the context, what's going on currently with this, what's the need for this family member to do this, what has led you to this decision, where's the
Well, there's a
ambivalence around it?
well, I don't know, Leslie. When she doesn't have a dad in the house. Um, her mom is not exactly the best mom, and I don't know how long her mom will live. Her mom is in very grave medical condition. And the problem is, logically, genealogically, if the mom were to pass away tomorrow, who is going to be there to bring in this person?
Mm,
Logically, family members would turn to me.
mhm,
But I can't tell my family members this person is the person from hell.
mm,
This person might disrupt the values and attitudes I've inculcated in my children over 15 and 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
So, my wife and I have certain expectations in our home. We have no idea what the values and attitudes this person might bring into our house. So,
Mm-hmm.
so,
Mm-hmm.
so how do I get over that, Leslie? How do I make a good decision here?
Mm.
Because the family member is kind of like hinting that they need to write a will, and they're kind of hinting that maybe I should be the guardian.
The new guardian.
Yeah,
Yeah, I guess this would take a
and
lot of contextual exploration because what has brought you have to consider the dynamics of your own family and the
yes,
the
yes.
pros and cons and whether there's somebody else in the family that's more well suited to taking this person in. And
Mhm,
is this
mhm.
it sounds like this is a minor child who still has some
Yes,
years to go before
yes.
where they're going to need to be
Teen
dependent
Let's
on a
say a
family,
teenager.
a
Let's say a
teenager.
teenager, yeah, let's say around 15 or 16.
And if you have children that are in a similar age range, this is
Yeah, I have
something that,
one kid older, one kid the same age, one kid younger.
and this family member may really need someone to go and live with, and you may be one of the people who could do that. But when you are also considering the needs of your own children, they have to come first. This is your primary
Yes,
family at home.
yes,
And
I agree
so
with you.
in order to know where to go with that, it would take a lot of exploration. And then what is it that your concerns are? And is there some way to mitigate those
Sure,
concerns so that you can ease
sure,
the integration of this family member in? It's a very
sure.
complex,
It
sounds
is.
like a very complex topic.
Two two quick points, Leslie.
Hmm.
One, I feel this kind of guilt because it's almost deja vu. My mom, whom I love so much, my mom was orphaned as a teenager at the age of 15.
Mm,
So now she was left all alone in the world.
hmm.
And luckily, her big brother took her in,
Hmm.
and she was secure. She now had a great foundation. He fit into a new neighborhood, and
Hmm.
from there had a beautiful life.
Hmm.
Am I, in a sense, facing the same situation that
Hmm.
my beloved mom did,
Hmm.
but I'm acting totally unlike my uncle did?
Hmm.
That causes me a little bit of ethical uh, quandary. Am
Yeah.
I less of a moral person than my uncle, who
Mm.
took in
Hmm.
his little sister who was orphaned without a second thought?
Hmm.
And here I am, Mr. Lawyer in San Diego,
Hmm.
obsessing about this a comparable situation.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah.
and then the final point is, I think part of it is, Leslie, I'm an introvert, and my wife is the extrovert in the family, and I just don't know how I would handle having disharmony brought into my home as an introvert. So,
Mm. Mm.
okay, let's stop. Let's freeze frame out of that situation. What I love, Leslie, what I love is you did not bring race into the conversation at the get go. You
Hmm.
saw me as a person, you saw me as an individual. You didn't tell me, well, now let's see whether or not you're actually internalizing some oppression here, Sonny
Yeah.
boy.
Yeah.
Let's see how that experience growing up in a southern suburb warped your mind to view the life through the filter of the oppressor. So I like that, Leslie. I think you are what we need in this day and age of racial dogma.
Yeah, I think it's beyond me how race would enter into that conversation.
But people could do that, right?
Well, and I think that it's relevant to the degree that it's relevant to the context of the person's situation. And
Right.
for the professional, for the helping professional to just automatically assume that is to insert something that's not being brought out by the client. And I think that there's this whole concept of broaching race. This is a big
Yes. Yes.
controversial topic in counseling, and it's the way we're going with counseling training. There are times when it might make sense if you feel like it's been kind of brought up around the edges and something that's been you should have the social intelligence to know that there's something that's
Right.
awkward or uncomfortable and that maybe it needs to be
Right.
brought to the surface, and that could be race, it could be anything,
Sure.
it could be
Sure.
something to do with any number of factors that you're kind of
Right.
hearing that the client is having difficulty raising, And you're
Mhm.
perceptive enough to know that maybe it's my job to broach this and bring it to the surface. Race is
Right.
just one of those variables that it could be.
Yes, that is so right. And it's just one of many dimensions of a person. So
Mhm,
the person that you're talking to, you're going to be able to read them. You're going to
mhm.
be able to tell, is this a baby Dr. Kendi I'm talking to? Or this is just your middle class, middle American, 1970s generation black guy who loves Bruce Hornsby in the range, hates rap. He's just that kind of a guy. You'll be able to read him and you won't interject race. And I think he or she will appreciate that. That's what I want from a therapist.
Mhm,
Someone who sees me doesn't just see the story of race.
mhm, mhm.
Yeah, yeah.
And I have to wonder if there's a whole new cohort of people who are so have been so indoctrinated into this way of
Mm.
thinking that that won't be how younger people expect their interactions to go.
And that terrifies me, Leslie,
Yeah.
to be honest. That just makes a chill go over my spine. So, for example, in our world hypotheticals, like suppose you have a kid who really is she or he has everything going for himself. Let's make it up. So this person who otherwise, has gone to the best private schools, has the best educated parents, there's no strife in the home, but this person in their classes, they're always taught blacks are victims,
Mhm,
blacks are downtrodden, blacks were slaves, there's historical trauma. They're walking around in fear of the police officer.
mhm, mhm,
They're afraid to enter the door. Here, read White Fragility. Read Between the World and Me. Read Anti-Racism, and you will be free, preppy black kid from the upper middle class home
mhm.
in Malibu, let's say. And so what happens, I fear, Leslie, is this type of black kid is going to have mental issues artificially created due to what he's hearing in the classroom in high school.
Mhm, mhm.
So by the time he gets into his Ivy League college, let's say it's Harvard, yeah, let's say it's Harvard, he's going to be going to the therapist's office as much as he can because he doesn't understand. I'm at Harvard, but I'm oppressed. I am victimized, but yet, I have these wonderful opportunities to work at management consulting firms or Goldman
Mhm,
Sachs or whatever.
mhm,
I think that the cohort you speak of in terms of indoctrination may have the knockoff consequences
mhm,
of creating more mental distress for non-conforming black kids who don't fit
mhm,
the caricature of what black people bring to the table.
mhm,
That's my
mhm.
thought. That's my thought.
Yeah, and it seems like a really unfair thing to put into someone's mind. Everybody hates you and they want to oppress you. Everybody's
Right, right.
suspicious of you. Everybody's afraid of you and all
Sure,
the sort of,
sure. Now,
stereotypes.
now, if you were a little me in the year 1969 outside of Richmond, Virginia, okay, you got a point. Okay. But not if you're living in Malibu in the
Mhm,
year 2023
mhm,
on a
mhm,
hill with, no. That's one of the problems I see, Leslie, is it's almost like we have freeze framed Black culture and consciousness.
hmm,
So that when we think of Black culture and consciousness, it's like from the 1950s, or it's like a 1960s movie reel.
mhm,
It never shows a sense of historical development over the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s, the
mhm,
2010s, the 2020s. I mean, we're all human.
mhm,
Imagine how much change has occurred in Black American families over those years. My
mhm,
father was born in 1934.
mhm,
My daughter born 2002. Imagine the Grand Canyon of difference in their racial experience,
mhm,
which I don't think your training materials would cover or address. So my dad could never call a white classmate a classmate because schools were segregated by race. My daughter has only known schools that are, let's say, 6% Black or less.
Mm-hmm.
So my dad has never flown an airplane, just hasn't, no
Mm-hmm.
reason to. My daughter is a world traveler, doesn't think
Mm-hmm.
twice about it, right? Um, my dad uh, lived in a world where he had great respect and esteem in the Black church as superintendent of the Sunday school. My daughter lives in a world where she gets great respect because she's a leader in a fraternity at an Ivy League institution.
Mm-hmm.
Those are just such great differences of experience. And I think that um, people who train therapists do Black families a disservice when they don't recognize the nuance and complexity of generational waves of experience over time. So, Leslie, I'm almost a nomad between my dad and my children, right? My dad never knew a desegregated school in his life.
Mm-hmm.
His son, well, I knew segregation first and second grade,
Mm-hmm.
but never a segregated time after second grade. My daughter never, ever, ever, never knew such a
Mm-hmm.
thing as segregation. So when we talk about race, I think it's really unfair for private school teachers teach young Black kids today stories that would have made sense in their grandparents' generation.
Mm-hmm.
Blackness is oppression, nothing else matters. It doesn't really account for all the differences that have happened with the rise of affirmative action and
Mm-hmm.
integration. Just my thought. Yeah.
So you really kind of see yourself as in a transitional generation between
I
two
do.
worlds.
I do. I think it's the greatest untold story in American literature and scholarship today.
Mm-hmm.
The greatest generation, I suspect, in terms of race, was the generation of kids who began life in Southern schools in all Black settings, but would later herald in a better world of desegregation and integration by the time they reached high school, I think. And so we learn how to be comfortable in the outside world. You learn not to be so distrustful of people because they are white. I mean, it amazes me that this Dr. Kendi fella,
Mm-hmm.
I read his book, and I think at one point he said he thought white people were aliens from outer space because they didn't really have that. For me, that shows a lack of intimate personal knowledge of other racial groups as a
Mm-hmm.
youngster.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in some ways we were really blessed in southern suburbs in the 1970s as that transition generation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Leslie, to be fair, it created some generational gaps.
Mm-hmm.
We always hear about generational gaps, maybe in white American families, but not so much Black American families. So my father was very, very opposed to me attending Harvard Law School.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because in his experience, Black lawyers attended Howard Law School. That's where Thurgood Marshall had gone, Charlie Houston, Spotswood Robinson, um, on and on. Uh, and so when I said to my father, well, Dad, Harvard Law School is the best, quote unquote, most dads would really care about that.
Mm-hmm.
And he turned to my mom. My mom was always my biggest supporter. And he said to my mom, how did he put it? You always supported him in his efforts. Now he's just trying to be white. He's trying to act white.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just a racial slur. That's just a racial misconception of ambition. But coming from your dad, it has a kind of a double punch. And so I think our relationship never was the same after
Mm-hmm.
that because he was not on board with my ambitions.
Mm-hmm.
Could you argue for racial reasons? Perhaps,
Mm-hmm.
because he didn't understand how his son could be so happy and accomplished and successful in a mostly white school.
Mm-hmm.
Because remember, to him, that was very alien. That was
Mm-hmm.
very strange.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, he During segregation, he would have to ride in a school bus past my high school, go to the segregated all black school, George Washington Carver High School.
Mm-hmm.
And yet his son, what, 20 years later, 25 years later, is the student body president of the
Mm-hmm.
very formerly all white school he couldn't attend.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of works a
Wow.
number in your mind. And I don't think we
Yeah.
really appreciate that so much in race literature or race scholarship. But the thing is, you don't hear my voices in the public square. and I think I know why, Leslie. I think it's because I don't really further the narrative. You know,
Hmm.
I'm not weeping
Hmm.
in sorrow for my Negrohood, quote unquote.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm pretty optimistic. I am a pretty, by genetic wiring, I have genes for, I think, optimism. I tend to look at the best side of things, the sunny side of things. I'm
Yeah.
a joyful person. And I think sometimes if you really buy into the dogma and the critical race theory, it breeds resentments, it
Hmm.
breeds grudge holding, it gives people a reason to explain why life is treating them poorly. And so it's a very inward looking dogma, critical race theory, I think. I mean, think of the very words oppression, marginalization, uh, intersectionality. I mean, all of these slogan words and others, they breed distance from the Black person in the larger world. We need words that do the opposite, I think. We need words that build up the inner individual. So, for example, let's talk more about words like self reliance, self ambition, self dignity, self
Hmm.
respect,
Hmm.
humanity. I mean, I think those words are more empowering for the inner person. But, I'm a heretic. What can I say?
Well, the joyful optimism really comes through in speaking with you, and also just in the messages that we've shared back and forth over, scheduling and
Sure.
things. And as I was telling you before we hit record, the 2L dropout in me was kind of intimidated to speak to the law professor, but
Oh,
you've been
oh,
so playful and
oh my
fun to
God. Oh
talk
my
to.
God. And I like worship you, Leslie.
Oh
I
gosh.
told you. I mean, you had the courage. You had the courage to drop out and do something. What gave you, if I could turn the tables, what gave you the courage to do that as
To
a
drop
as a
out of law
2L?
school? Oh my
Yes.
gosh.
That's the great
Well,
story. Listeners, this is the great story here.
oh, it was complicated when I was in undergrad. I was really torn between graduate study in psychology and going into law school. And
Yes.
I had sort of started to think about counseling because I realized what I really wanted to do overall was to just work with people, in
Right.
individuals or small groups, families, to help
Yes.
solve problems in whatever way. I could do that through law, or I could do that through counseling. The program that I was in, my undergrad, was really heavily focused on clinical psychology, and
Mm.
they had a they looked down their nose at counseling psychology as
Oh,
it's just this soft thing, you want to go clinical. And I
right,
never
right, right.
really liked the clinical perspective. I really liked the softer,
Yes.
more human side of things. And so I I went ahead and went towards law school because I didn't really see myself going into academia. And then in my first year, I realized I'd made a mistake, but I stuck it out. And so in my second year, I decided to take a leave of absence. I also had some personal stuff going on with my family.
Okay.
So I took a leave of absence and gave it some thought and decided to go to graduate school instead. So that's
Very,
the whole reason. Yeah.
very mature move, if I can say, as a former law professor. Very mature because you had the ability to go against conformity. Because I suspect there were tremendous peer pressures or herd group think that, well, this is the path you're on. And if you drop out, you've wasted 1 year of your life. You've wasted 1 year of.
Yeah.
I know all the arguments. I recognize them well. So I just really, really am your fan that you had this self-awareness to reach that decision.
That's a very generous I guess spin on that, because the other spin is that here I've kind of made a pattern of going into graduate programs and pulling back out. So there's two ways to look at that, I guess. Thank you for your very kind spin. But
Okay.
as you're talking about your perspective on your own life trajectory, you have, as
Yes.
you say, this very joyous, optimistic spin, which is,
Yes.
or perspective. I guess that's how it feels to you. And as you say, it doesn't fit the narrative, which is
Right.
this narrative of oppression. And yet, one thing I want to ask you about is, even as you talk about it, there's this degree to which racial dynamics have been a part of your story as
Hmm.
you tell the story. And I think one of the points that the critical race theorists want to always they want to hammer home is like, oh, you white people never had to think about this. you just go through life as American neutral.
Sure.
You're just American neutral. You don't race doesn't impact you. Whereas for Black people and for people of other racial backgrounds, they have to be aware of this in a way that it really impacts their own development. So there's this sort of desire to sort of level that and have everybody think about it in a way. And what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I think that says not much. I mean, there are many dimensions of a person that are unique to that person
Yeah.
that you may have to think about that someone else doesn't. So, for example,
Yeah.
I'm right-handed. I never think about that because it's a right-handed society. But if I were left-handed, I would.
Mm-hmm.
I have asthma. I think about asthma. If I didn't, I would never think about it. But the point is, it's just something I think about, and I then move ahead in life. What's another example? Well, I'm an introvert, and that indeed influences a lot of my life. I think about it. For example, when I'm in a reception or a breakfast group or a meeting with people I've never met before, I'm always thinking and rethinking. So, what's a conversational hook? What's a path of commonality?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, how can I make that person laugh or feel a connection? I give this a lot of thought before I go into that dreaded reception.
You map
My
it out.
wife, yeah, my wife is an extrovert. My mother-in-law's an extrovert. I give it a time of day. I just go into that meeting and they're in their element like a fish in water. So the point being, we all have dimensions of things we think about that others don't. But that's just part of being a human. Race is just one of many things. It has not made a difference in my life to the degree that it's noteworthy,
Mm-hmm.
to be honest with you. Now, if it were the year 1969, yeah, you bet, noteworthy.
Mm-hmm.
Year 2023, to be honest, it's more noteworthy because I have to navigate and understand these slogan words that
Mm-hmm.
make no sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
So, in a sense, the critical race theorists are creating the very dynamic. They then look to say, well, see, this is why you don't have privilege because you're having to deal with. No, having to deal with the consequences of your warping the public discourse to include things like race. Case in point, I never, ever, ever, never would have thought about my race when visiting a doctor, for example. But I've read these crazy things about the American Medical Association and structural racism and marginalism. So I know, and I hate to admit, I for for many, many, many years, I've had doctors and dentists and physicians uh, of different racial groups. Never gave it a second thought. It's only now that I read organizations like the AMA give it a second thought, that
Mm-hmm.
medical schools are giving it a second thought,
Mm-hmm.
that the cohort of medical kids coming out of schools are giving a second thought. Now I have to kind of think about, should I give it a second thought? Do I
Mm-hmm.
need to like make it clear it's me, Wink, not the generic Black American
Mm-hmm.
male, not the cardboard figure. It's me. I get my own little genomic profile. Want to see it? There's only one me. You laugh, Leslie, but I actually have given my genomic profile to my physician because I wanted him to know my unique 20,000 genes, who I am.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow. That's so interesting as we see all these position statements coming out and all these trainings. Uh,
Yeah.
it,
It
when
stresses out the individual who happens to be Black. That's
right.
that's the deal.
And
Yeah.
the words that you used words when you were talking about positive representations or positive ways of going through life, self-reliance,
Yes. Yes.
self-respect.
Yes.
These are all
Yes.
words that have to do with individual agency. And
Yes.
when we're taking this collectivist, reductionist lens, we're flattening people
You're
down, and it's really quite dehumanizing, and it takes the
well,
individual out of the equation.
irony. You're marginalizing the individual.
Mhm.
You're
Mhm.
marginalizing the individual.
Wow.
You're imposing collectivism on someone who,
Huh.
by dint of personality and temperament, doesn't live that way. You don't exist that way. I think it's one of the greatest coming problems, and it's going to be the clash between the collectivists, for whom this seems natural and good,
Mhm.
and the genuine individual who's going to
Mhm.
feel more and more to use an overused word, oppressed, or at least disconnected from larger forces. I really, really, really don't want any institution to view me through the filter or lens of race, view me through the lens of filter of who I am as an individual, because I've had a unique journey and step through life that needs to be seen and appreciated. And it makes me stronger. It makes you stronger. Those who are wise about race, the collectivists for whom I must be oppressed because I'm a Black guy, or the individualist who says, okay, Wink, tell me your story. What do you love to do? Who are your heroes in life? That person is more affirming, quote unquote, than the collectivists. We gotta rise up, the individuals who are out there. I think there's a growing psychological movement, and nonconformers can feel it in their souls. We know we're being fed a bill of goods. We know that more and more associations, institutions are being captured, and we're going to resist because it's in our nature, Leslie, to not accept things without questioning them. I know you feel that way, and I feel that way too. But my sense is, in a way, I'm ahead of my time because I think these things go through generational cycles. So I think the collectivist will have its heyday. But what will happen is little kids will grow up and they will reject that. They will not want to embrace dogma. They will begin to scoff at it. They'll begin to mock it. And then eventually you'll have the rise of a new generation of beatniks, hipsters. I call them nonconformist intellectuals. And they'll change the dynamic, but it'll take a generation. It'll take a generation. So
Yeah.
I won't be here to see it, but I think it'll take some time.
Well, I think you're right. And that's something that gives me hope as well. It's just this sort of, these things cycle through. And one of the things that, well, first of all, I just want to say, I really love the phrase that because you're using their language, and it's so beautiful. Marginalizing the individual.
Yes.
And
Oh,
that's
Leslie,
so true. I really love that.
We could talk. We could talk. We could talk. It's like, let's talk since we're talking.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that, Leslie? Because I was thinking about there over the past few nights. If one really scoffs at slogan words, is it ethical and moral to skillfully use the tools of the master, quote unquote, against the dogmatists, against the critical race theorists? Should nonconformers double down and simply flip this script and use the very words against the forces of conformitism? What do you think about that?
I mean, I think it's a rhetorical tool that has some
And you feel good about it.
validity. Yeah, I mean, I think that we have many tools. I mean, mockery is one, satire is one, using their language is one, and then having long form discussions that involve a lot of nuance is another.
Right.
The meme war is kind of interesting also, which is kind of like the mockery and the satire and finding humor in it. And one of the things about the critical social justice movement as a whole, the identity politics field, is it's humorless. It's really with its microaggressions, and it's always looking for. So you're I know I've used this example before on this in these discussions, but when in my program we were taught about using your privilege, and we were talking about being a white savior. And so being a white savior is bad, using your privilege is good, but the examples were virtually identical. And so you end up just like afraid to do anything because you're just going to mess up in any which way, which is the death of humor, because we can't play if we can't take risks of making mistakes.
Exactly. The death of society. Yeah. So that's another tool, humor, the ability to be joyful, the ability to mock those who lack the ability to see the irony in life.
Yeah.
It's funny. I mean, I suspect there are some people for whom, if you merely utter the word affirm, it's like a trance. It's like you flip a switch and they have to bow down like Pavlov's dog. I mean, think about that. Think about that. Try that. Yeah, use certain words and see if the conformer is able to resist your manipulations.
Right. Like I've heard people refer to, instead of gender affirmative care, body affirmative care, which affirms the physical body that you're born into and that you're not born in. So there's little flips like that.
Exactly. Now let's be really radical. Really radical. I had this nascent idea, which won't let go, and I began to like write an essay or two about it. If the world is set on fire with trans ideology or dogma to dissipate the understanding of gender, could it be that the same tools of trans, in terms of the words, help us get beyond race as a category, transracials, in other words?
Mm-hmm.
Do Does the idea of transracials offer us a sustainable escape hatch from the manipulations of critical race theory? Because critical race theory presumes an inflexible race, blackness.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing else matters, oppression. But if you dissolve those categories and recognize that racial consciousness and culture is on a spectrum,
Mm-hmm.
and we must affirm the transracials,
Mm-hmm.
they must live in human dignity. They are tired of living a lie. The cisgenders are the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
The cisracials are the enemy.
Cisracial.
The
Yeah.
cisracials are the
Yeah.
enemy. We have to put aside the binary in blackness. Let that give us an escape hatch out of these crazy ways of thinking about blackness.
And yet it doesn't seem like people who try the transracial thing are very well accepted. I immediately think of Rachel Dolezal.
Of
Yeah.
course, yes, yes, yes. And I think that's because I see her as almost maybe a vanguard. It's
Mm,
like the
okay.
lone scout,
Yeah.
the scout who's ahead of the band of settlers. But could it be over time, as you have more and more mixed families,
Mm-hmm.
as you have more and more blacks for whom their life is not Ta-Nehisi Coates in inner city Baltimore, Maryland.
Mm-hmm.
Their
Mm-hmm.
life is Scarsdale. Their life is Malibu. Their life is Greenwich, Connecticut. Their life is Honolulu, Hawaii.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Mm-hmm.
could it be that there will develop a demand for racial tools, racial
Mm,
language that transcends the world of cisracials?
mm,
So maybe it's kind of like you change the language one step at a time.
mm-hmm.
Maybe someone writes an article in the Harvard Law Review, or the Leo Law Journal, the oppression of cisracials, and people go, ooh.
Mm-hmm.
And then someone says, and what does that mean? Well, that means there's a binary that
Mm.
exists within blackness. What does that
Yeah.
mean? Well, that means we must address that binary. What does that mean? And then it kind of goes step by step by
Mm-hmm.
step.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just an
Well,
idea, just
well,
a
it's
thought.
really interesting, and I think people who are of mixed race background have a lot of trouble deciding sometimes how they want to,
Yeah,
how what they identify with most, and they get pressure from different
yes,
groups. From this group,
yes,
you're being too much like them, or you're not enough
sure,
like us, or whatever it is. And
exactly.
when I was a kid growing up as one of a small number of white kids in an area that was largely Hispanic, probably
Mhm,
similar number of black kids and white kids, but white was, as far as I was aware, it was the worst thing you could be. I really
mhm,
didn't. It was
mhm.
similar when you describe being a kid and going to school and getting those slurs. I wasn't
Oh
going
yeah,
through desegregation by any means, but I was quickly aware of words like honky and Pleta and
right, right.
Lulia and things that were being thrown at me. And I didn't, and the first time I heard honky, I wanted to laugh at it, but then I saw how mean they were. It was like,
Ah.
oh, that's not funny. So, I wanted to be anything but, and my grandmother was, my dad's stepmother was Mexican American. And, I really wanted to identify into something else. I would have
Mm,
clung to, it was kind of a thing that I played with for a little while. Like, my
sure,
grandma's Mexican, so don't call me white. Of course, I'm as white as the day is long. She wasn't my blood, but
sure, right, right.
it was a thing. So I can see people wanting to use it as a kind of get out of jail free card. And the
Which,
LGBT identities kind of serve as that
right,
right now for a whole generation of
I
kids
agree.
who are being told that
Right,
they're carrying all this unearned privilege.
yes. But tell me how your life would have been better if you had had the ability to live free of rigid racial categories, rigid racial boxes. How would your life have been better? in Texas?
Well, I think that in-group, out-group dynamics and racial
Mhm.
discrimination is certainly one of those, one of a big one, are harmful for the people that experience them. I think that it
Mhm.
causes you to have, and there can be a story of overcoming and of growing stronger from facing something like that, or there can be a story of being really harmed and kind of having
Sure.
a part of yourself squashed by that. And so
Right.
bullying it's a double-edged sword in a way. I think that
Yeah.
I think I'm probably, in some ways, I'm better off for having experienced that. I think it taught
Mm.
me a lot about empathy. It taught me a lot about I've even thought that somehow, you talk about nonconformists. Do early experiences of not fitting in seamlessly kind of break some of the mystique of the group for some people and
Oh, I
allow
love
them to
that.
know what it's like to
I love
be
that.
on the outside and that it's still okay to be outside?
I love that. I think
So,
there's something to that. I think there's something to that. I do. I do. Huh, that's a good point. 'Cause I'm thinking about my own experience when I was in the first and second grade, my all black classes, and I have a sense of nonconformity. In a sense that I love to read, that I love to be myself, that I love to think. Um, but I think it was in integrated settings that the nonconformity became more pronounced
mm,
and more a badge of something, more a badge of my individuality. I guess that's it. I never viewed myself as a member of a group for my identity in an all black setting. And in an all white setting in grade school, my identity came from who I was on the inside and what my dreams and goals and aspirations were. And I
mhm,
accepted people as people. It didn't matter to me what race you were. What mattered to me was, do we have the same quirkiness?
mhm,
Are we both nerds? Do we enjoy to read? Are we in the
mhm,
gifted and talented program?
mhm,
Do we look at life in a different way? Those were the things that really struck me in my white junior and high school. And I think
mhm,
that's good, actually. I wonder, I'm going to speculate, Leslie, query, would having gone to a black college or a black law school have suppressed my individuality?
mm,
Because the pressures to conform to racial dogma might have been stronger.
mm,
Ironically, I may have found my true self more at Harvard Law School
mm,
than I might have at, say, Howard Law School. Just a thought. Just a
mhm,
thought. I mean, because as you probably know, Leslie, there's a lot of ah, what's the word I'm looking for? There's a lot of conformity in Black culture and consciousness, by and large. 76% of Black Americans, according to the Pew Research Survey, believe Blackness is extremely important or very important to one's sense of self.
mm,
76%.
mm, mm,
But that means 24% feel it's of zero importance or little importance to one's
mm,
sense of self.
mhm,
I mean, I'm clearly in the 24%.
mhm,
I didn't apply for membership. It's just that I happen to be, right? But query whether or not, as a member of the 24%, I'm always um, at odds or ill at ease with the 76%.
mm,
Am I accustomed to having to suppress my real thoughts or think twice for the sake of harmony in Black settings, but in integrated settings or white settings, I feel greater freedom to be myself?
mm,
Does that make sense? That maybe I wouldn't have this conversation perhaps with the typical Black YouTube podcaster,
mm,
because odds are that person would be in the 76% for
mm.
whom Blackness is very important or extremely important. Whereas you may be more like those in the Black minority, the 24%, who feel race is of no importance to one's sense of self
Mm,
or
mm,
little importance to one's sense of self. So,
mhm,
like, yeah, like in other words, to rephrase, if Ta-Nehisi Coates or Dr. Kendi were on this podcast interviewing me, I'm not so sure I would feel so light and easy and free flowing.
Yeah.
I think you have to be, I think open minds bring out the best in me. They bring
Mm,
out the individual.
mhm,
Closed minds cause me to retract like a turtle might retract its head into its shell.
mhm, mhm,
So if you really want to affirm people and bring out the human soul and spirit, we need more open minds in society, less closed minds in society.
oh
The
yeah,
individual needs the individual needs
yeah,
to step up and help to bring forth that better day, I think.
absolutely,
So look, a
absolutely.
revolutionary.
No, it seems like
I'm a
that.
gentle revolutionary.
Yeah, it is very and you know, speaking of revolutionary, and I feel like I want to go like 10 different directions off of what you just said.
For it, Leslie.
But yeah, it's stunning that there obviously there are some people to whom their experiences around race are going to be extremely important to their
Exactly.
current reality
Yeah.
and to their
Right.
formation, and they're going to have triumphs and they're going to have wounds and they're going to have
Yeah.
all manner of experiences around these things. But
Right.
to assume to teach counselors, for instance, to assume that by looking at someone's skin you can know something of substance about their experiences, their character, or their temperament, I just I find that just incredibly it's stunning that that's being taught right now in 2023. In the 2020s, we're
What
teaching this
what
in schools.
it's lazy thinking. It's
Yeah,
lazy
yeah.
thinking. You can't look at a black person and tell yourself,
Mhm.
I think he's in the 76%. So I
Yeah.
better be really, really
Mm,
down with the people. Or I think she's in the 24%. So I can
mm.
just sit back and just, you know, treat her as if she were in the Cosby show or something like that. You just can't tell.
Yeah, yeah.
It's not, it's now I'm gonna go a little bit further. Leslie, I have found the most interesting phenomena in my lifetime. So I'm Wink. I call myself Wink. You call myself Wink. But my full name is Winkfield Franklin Twyman Jr. You know how sometimes they have these studies that part of the oppression is black names, that the HR person gets a resume,
Mhm.
they can tell the black it's a trash can.
Yeah.
Would you be able to tell if you were an HR director, you got my resume with my full name, would you think that's a black name?
No, I wouldn't.
Uh-huh. What would you think?
I would think it was an interesting name. I would kind of wonder whether Twyman. I don't know if I would wonder if you were. Now maybe this shows my ignorance of names and geography, but
Sure,
I
sure,
might think like European or something. Winkfield. What is that? Some
sure, sure.
German, or I don't know. I don't know what I would think.
Here's a true story, Leslie, which is why
Mhm,
I bring it up. I
mhm,
was at the doctor's office for this dreadful cold last
mhm,
week,
mhm.
and the doctor's working up my report, and she looks at the screen, and she turns to me and says, "That's an interesting name you have. That sounds very regal. Can you tell me more about your name?" So that's an example number one.
Mhm,
Second example, I was working on Capitol Hill with Congressman Barney Frank, as you probably know.
mhm,
Uh, I used to be his LA's legislative assistant. So I dealt with constituents. And I remember we had this long relationship with a constituent who was a former congressman from New Hampshire, a French Canadian. And we would joke and laugh over the phone. We had a great old time, as you and I are having today, Leslie. And at one point, the congressman said to me, "So tell me about your name." And I thought, I'm going to play with him because I bet he has a mental image of me because it's my name. I said, "Well, Congressman such and such, it's a Teutonic name. The name comes from Northern Germany. Hey, blah, 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 blah. Well, I can't wait to meet you." So the trap was set. And so maybe a few days later, he came to Barney's office to meet me for the first time. And his jaw dropped. And it was funny because I knew he had a certain mental
mhm,
image in
mhm,
his mind of the
mhm.
name. And then when he saw me, well, no, that wasn't. The name can be German, doesn't mean you're a German
Yeah.
person. Uh, Third example, I was in law school. I got a summer job in a law firm, named a law firm, and I was a summer associate. And I began working there was in DC. The first day I was there, I had lunch with another summer associate. She was talking over lunch, and she said to me, when I saw your name, I thought you were a Boston Brahmin, like a wasp, but you're not.
Mm-hmm.
So she was kind of disappointed, I think, in a way. Maybe she had images of this, Winthrop, the third person coming and, being a boyfriend or something. But my point is, I've often wondered, Leslie, if we presume names are our ambassadors in the larger world, that names kind of are our proxy until people see us in the flesh, how has my unique name been a
Mm-hmm.
benefit or not? And
Mm-hmm.
has my unique name perhaps given me a different racial experience from those who might have a more caricature or stereotypical Black name?
Mm-hmm.
I've wondered
Mm-hmm.
about that, but how
Mm-hmm.
would you ever prove that, right? How would you ever prove that?
It's
I don't,
it's an interesting line of inquiry, and it kind of goes back to what you said about all the different variables that are present in our lives that we
that's
don't
right.
know to what degree they're influencing us, but we know that they
That's right.
are, because we're a
That's right.
constellation of so many variables.
Exactly.
But
Exactly.
it is interesting, the experiences around your name.
It's true. It's a final experience. We were on vacation in Bermuda. My
Mhm.
oldest was 1 year old, I think. And of course, he's the third. Now, you would ask the question where the name came from. Well, the name is historical. My great uncle was named Winkfield Twyman in 1893. My dad is a senior. I'm junior. My son is the third. So we were at that counter in Bermuda, and the counter lady asked for our passport. We gave it to her, and we gave her my son's passport. And it was funny, her reaction to the name that, the little kid was the third, that he
Mhm.
was. Oh, and the third. I think it was like a reaction. It was a Black counter staffer, and that may or may not matter. But I thought it was kind of like maybe the name didn't befit the family or didn't like seem to
Mm.
what she was expecting.
Hmm.
But who can say? Who can judge those things? But I do think it's
Do
in.
you think you experienced a microaggression?
No, no. I was
I'm
intrigued.
sorry.
I was intrigued. No,
I'm
you have to
sorry.
ask a good question. Good
Yeah.
question. I don't
No,
experience.
and
I
I don't mean
experience
to make fun of
macroaggressions.
that, but yeah, yeah, yeah. The word microaggression is an
Yeah.
interesting one.
Uh-huh.
Oh,
But I remember you had made a point earlier about cohorts, and how
yeah, the younger
younger
cohort.
generations. I sometimes feel when I'm on the streets of San Diego that kids who are white
Hmm.
are less open to just having kickback, joyful, chill
Hmm.
conversations.
Hmm.
That I remember when I was in college and law school and in my 30s and 40s. I mean, it's something I can't really put my finger on.
Hmm.
One example I remember, there was this white lady in my office building, wonderful lady, and we used to walk together to work on occasion.
Hmm.
And I remember, because we were so friendly, I remember deciding to ask her a question. It was a question involving um, making sense of my relationship to a historical figure who happened to be white American.
Hmm.
And it was just an ordinary, average question. And you should have seen her demeanor change. It was like a flip turned on, and she had a different expression on her face. And she kind of said, "I can't talk about this,"
Hmm.
and just kind of walked away. It was a very strange thing. I
Hmm.
can't talk about this. We had been talking about everything under the sun
Hmm.
before that,
How
but the
interesting.
moment I raised the question involving, and the guy is George Washington, and whether or
Oh.
not it was kind of interesting for a Black American to have a relationship to someone like that. And
Hmm.
she just shut down.
She just
It's
couldn't go there.
right. And I
Hmm.
wonder if that was because of PIE training, because of her classes
Hmm.
in college or
Hmm.
grad
Hmm.
school. And hopefully that's just an anomaly. But if it's not an anomaly,
Oh,
then it
I
doesn't
think people are terrified to talk about it. I think younger
then it
people
doesn't
are so scared to have those kind of conversations.
then
They've
it
just
doesn't
been
bode
told
well.
they can't talk about it this way,
Oh,
but they also can't talk about it that way.
oh,
And either,
Leslie, true story. True
yeah.
story. I'm giving a presentation at University of San Diego Law School
Hmm.
as a former law professor. And I'm talking about some dry, dull topic. Even I was bored. So after, 45 minutes were over out of my hour session, I was like ready to go. But it was a Q&A session. And the kids were, mindless, looking up to the ceiling, looking at their watch.
Hmm.
One guy asked me a race-related question. I think it was like, well, what was your life like or your racial experience? Something like that. And I just answered naturally, like you and I are talking right now. Leslie, Leslie. It was like the switch had flipped on. Kids went from being mindless, morose, not there, to eyes wide
Oh,
open
wow.
on the edge of their chairs, leaning in, listening to. It was like I was spouting words in the context of
Oh,
race they had never heard. And these are like law students. This year was like
wow.
2015, 2016. And that made an impression on me because I was speaking stuff that would have been not worthy of note in the 1970s or 80s. It's
Hmm.
like I'm talking to you right now. But it was clear to me that they had never heard someone in authority
Hmm.
talk about race without using those slogan words:
Yeah.
oppression, marginality, privilege,
Yeah.
for just. And I just thought, good Lord, what's happening to these law students?
Amazing.
They're going to be the judges one day. They're going to
Right.
be the members of Congress one day.
Right.
That's not good. You need to have people who feel free to talk and don't
Hmm.
worry about. I mean, the aim should be the search for truth.
Hmm.
The aim should not be the search for dogma. The
Yeah.
aim should not, those are two different worlds. And I want to live in this world, the search
Yeah.
for truth, not that world, the search for dogma. So,
Absolutely. And it is really concerning to see all of the different areas of life that this is going to increasingly impact as
yes,
this cohort
yes,
goes through and
yes,
becomes the
yes,
professional generation.
yes,
And yet one of
yes.
my real hopes is something you sort of touched on a little bit earlier, is that there's this rebellious spirit in young people. They
Yes,
I I,
yes.
I think that one of the things that identity politics or intersectionality, critical race theory, gender ideology, all these things, one of the things that they offer is that there's we were talking a lot when I was studying sociology in the early 2000s, the early aughts.
Okay.
um, there was this big concept of anomie, where people were going to start to feel alienated from meaning in their life as we became more automated, and as people became less individually had less individual agency and less ability to harness their own individual potential in life. And so we were facing this crisis of anomie, and we knew this was something the sociology professors were big on at the time. And it seems like what intersectionality and social justice ideology has provided, it's provided a sense of identity, a sense of
Oh,
belonging, and above all, a quest, because people need a quest, I think, to have something to
mm,
push off against in
yeah,
order to be seeking meaning.
right.
And this sort of offers that in one package. But as the next generation comes through and this is being pushed on them by their teachers, I think that the rebellious spirit eventually says, I'm not just taking the quest you're offering me. I'm not
Yeah.
going to do it the way that you guys are doing it. I think people naturally want to rebel as young people and distinguish themselves. So my hope is that we're going to see some of that come through as
That,
and
that,
hopefully in our lifetimes. As you said, you don't think you'll see it in your lifetime, but I hope we will. I hope
I
it won't
know.
take too long.
I mean, that's my hope too. And so I ask you, Leslie,
Mhm.
what is the role for people of my generation in their 60s? What is the place for people who feel like they are part of a nomad generation?
Mhm.
For those who knew Jim Crow segregation toddlers and who now know racial dogma and critical race theory in our elder years, what's our role right now in this decade? What can we do? What should we say?
Well, that's a really big question, and I'm sure it's multifaceted. The answer is multifaceted, but I think that one of the potential answers could be found in the response that you saw those students have when you started speaking
Yes,
with Nuance. And it's
yes.
that your generation, and even Generation X, my generation, and older,
Mhm.
we have we grew up being able to speak in terms of nuance in a way that the
Right,
younger generation has been increasingly had. It's been drummed out of them, and
right,
they've been taught to be afraid of honest conversation and
right.
to parrot in catchphrases. So I think maybe the ability to still have good dialogue and to be fearless
Mm,
in your willingness to
mhm,
engage with nuance is
mhm.
a role.
I think you're right. I think you're right. I think you're onto something. I remember there was a guy at a conference maybe 2 months ago who said to me that a lot of these kids don't know what it meant to go to a segregated all black school.
Mm-hmm.
So your experience really is living
Mm-hmm.
history in a sense,
Mm-hmm.
which I didn't really appreciate at the moment,
Mm-hmm.
because everyone kind of thinks of their history as unique,
Mm-hmm.
as kind of the world, and it is to some
Mm-hmm.
degree. But if you look at my daughter, for example, born in the year what 2002, so to her, Jimmy Carter is ancient history.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas to me, Jimmy Carter's it was like a guy who's president of junior high school. Uh, so it's interesting because when I tell her stories about Virginia and what I knew, he says to me, "Well, Dad, it's like watching a history documentary screen, and the film is rolling, and you're talking, and it's in black and white, like Twilight Zone episodes, and so it's removed from her life experience, which it makes sense. But the danger is her life experience is this more pernicious dogma existence, which seems to not be the way towards a very open, abundant life of joy and nuance and complexity. I'm not sure where that life is leading to, but I will say this. I mean, I do think that um, hopefully one day she will appreciate, and all of my kids will, and all the young generation will appreciate that these are the best times in American history to be a young Black adult.
Mm-hmm.
Beats the 1690s, beats the 1790s, beats the 1890s, even beats the 1990s. And so I'm not sure why that common sense message doesn't permeate the airways. Why is it when I'm reading or listening to NPR, I don't hear that message? These were the best of times. I hear another message. These are the worst of times.
Mm-hmm.
So that,
Mm-hmm.
that bothers me, Leslie, actually. I'll
Mm-hmm.
be in the car with my wife, in a good mood. Life is great, joyful. I'm thinking good thoughts. And on comes NPR, and there's some story about some racial incident back in the
Mm-hmm.
1930s. And we know it's going to be downtrodden, and we know the end of this story.
Mm-hmm.
And your spirits are depressed, and you hear the slogan words, and you go from feeling my, it's a wonderful blue sky day to
Yeah. Well, I think what you're really underscoring is the power of perspective, and whether it's about anything really, race, war,
yeah,
culture, in any, gender. You just pick a topic. We have different ways we can look at things, and there are some times when there's less ability to shift your focus, but then there's other times when there's a lot. And when you're talking about something that has so much individual variability, then there are as many
yes.
ways to look at it as there are individuals who are experiencing it.
Where does perspective come from? Where does
Where
that
does
come
it
from,
come from?
Leslie? Yeah. Is it environmental? Is it
Mm,
genetic? Is it cultural? Is it learned? Is it some combination of the four?
mm.
And
In terms of temperamental outlook and
sure.
ability, I think it's a lot of different things. I think there's a lot of
Mhm,
different factors. We have
mhm.
inborn temperament, which is one part of it.
Right,
Then you have the
right.
experiences that you've been exposed to and what's been modeled for
Yeah.
you.
I've always thought that perspective is a factor of one's creativity.
Mm,
It's a factor of one's insight, one's intuition, right? So the more you're inclined to examine life as opposed to living the unexamined life, I think that tends to dig a deeper lens for deeper perspective. Does that make sense? Like if you
mm-hmm.
are a true raging extrovert who lives for the next party, who lives for the sorority get together, the fraternity night out, you're not really going to think maybe that deeply about life all the time. But if you
Yeah.
have a different inclination, I think that kind of leads you towards a deeper perspective about
Mhm,
things. If
mhm,
that makes
mhm,
sense.
mhm. It does make
Yeah.
sense. It does. I like
Yeah.
that outlook, combining it with creativity. And speaking of,
Perhaps
huh? Go
are we all
ahead, please,
you
please.
go. Oh, you sure? Okay. I was just
Yeah.
gonna say, once again, it's the same thing. That even if you are even if you had that kind of that temperament, that
Mhm.
that hunger for curiosity, for insight, for intuition, for deeper meaning behind the surface, you're in the minority.
Mhm.
People like that, I think introverts alone are just what, 25%, 20% of the population. So you're outnumbered by extroverts from the get-go. So it's once again that idea of always feeling that you know who you are, but you also know that who you are is not who most people are. That's a good way to put it. So
Mm.
you
Mhm.
know that you don't really care about Blackness as a part of your sense of self. But you recognize that most Black people do.
Mhm.
You recognize that you really don't want to go to that faculty dinner tonight. Most people in the faculty do want to go to that dinner tonight and socialize or whatever. You recognize that your idea of a good time on the airplane is to read, even though you also know that most people enjoy talking with the seatmate and getting to know someone else. I think those little differences in temperament, for me at least, are way more important than race per se. If I
Mhm.
were to see a therapist, yeah.
Mhm. Mhm. And it's, yeah, I think that's really, that aligns very much with what I hoped we would hear in a counseling program, and
Oh
it's
yeah.
not what we heard, but thank you so much for giving that perspective. And, um, I wanna make sure I've taken a lot of your time, I've really enjoyed this
Oh no,
conversation,
no
and
stress, no
I would
stress.
love to talk with you at length on all of these things and more.
Oh
Um,
sure, you're a fun person. I
yeah,
enjoy.
thank you, you are
I
too.
I I tell you, I love great conversations. I do.
Mhm,
And one of the things that saddens me is I sense more and more we don't have the space to do that in the public square. And
mhm,
that's
mhm.
sad. That's kind of sad.
And I think some of that seems like it's related to the short attention span that we've cultivated with the internet.
TikTok.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, but it is a shame. I mean, I even noticed my own attention span is shorter than it used to be, and I
Oh,
don't
really?
like that. Yeah, I really don't like
Mm.
that. But
Hopefully
I
you're
have
not on
more trouble
TikTok, right?
sitting. No, I'm not. But I do have more trouble sitting and reading a book than I used to, and I used to read
Mm.
voraciously. So,
Yeah.
but books, your book with Jennifer Richmond, how
Yes.
could you tell me a little bit about how you 2 conceptualized this book and how it came to be?
Sure. Um, well, Jennifer, my co-author, she lived for a period of time overseas in China.
Mhm,
And when she returned to the States, she was a Native American, but when she returned to the States, he was, excuse me, she was struck by the division and the polarization in public discourse about race. That
mhm,
the different groups seemed to be at loggerheads, that
mhm,
there was no longer sort of a sense of common shared values and norms.
mhm,
And that troubled her. And she wanted to learn more. She's a curious person.
mhm,
So she sought out the a diversity training program run by the city of Austin, Texas.
mhm,
And she went there expecting to learn more about how to understand other people. And what she found was the exact opposite. She found affinity groups based upon race.
mhm, mhm.
She found dogma. She found slogan words. She found white self hatred,
Yeah.
the expectation that one needed to beat the drums in terms of guilt and white fragility. And so something inside of her refused to drink the Kool Aid.
Mhm,
Something inside of her refused to go along. And so she had one of those classic um, moments of, excuse me, freedom or individual thought. She raised her hand. He was shaking, quivering, and she basically said, I don't see how this is a constructive good, more or less. I don't see how we're lowering divisions when we're doing things to increase racial division and
mhm,
consciousness.
mhm,
And the other whites, of course, it was the only white affinity group,
mhm,
notice the assumption affinity is race based.
mhm,
So all the
mhm.
other whites in the group looked at her as if she were some kind of demon child, some kind of monster. They physically removed themselves from her.
Oh,
She was quite taken aback
wow.
by that. And so he collected her thoughts. In terms of Briggs Myers personality, she's an INFJ,
Mhm,
intuitive feeling. Let's see, intuitive. No, 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 no. Introverted feeling, intuitive judging. That's right.
Mm-hmm,
And so
mm-hmm,
she wrote an essay for Ariel magazine online about this experience. So the next morning after it was published, I read the magazine. It usually has good essays and ideas. So I read it and I thought, this is a kindred spirit. This is
mm,
someone who's feeling that same sense of disconnect and
mm-hmm,
alienation um, and disillusionment as I am. So I quickly shot off an email to her,
mm-hmm,
wishing her well, because she was trying to put together a project of letters for people. And I also made the point that I thought she should be encouraging people to write her who also were of old American stock. Because I
mm,
thought that you need to get together people of all races who had family roots dating back to the 1600s and the 1700s,
mm,
because those families would understand American slavery as a family matter,
mm,
as opposed to reaching out to someone like my friend, I'll call her Julia, who is a Hong Kong immigrant. She's been here for 5 years.
mm,
She has no time for talk about reparations for American slavery. She feels no sense of
mm-hmm,
guilt. She
mm-hmm,
thinks it's all bogus.
mm-hmm,
So I suggested that Jennifer should address a certain cohort, a demographic.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
So Jennifer was surprised and happy to hear from me. I think that she was delighted and she could sense I was open minded. She corresponded back with me, and I was delighted to hear from her. There's a lot of dogma in my household, so I was happy to be able to talk with someone free of dogma about
yeah,
race. And so we started talking with one another, and we developed the idea: let's put this correspondence, which we've developed, into a full-fledged book.
mm,
And so we did,
oh,
and that was the creation of our book, Letters in Black and White. So it was good for her because I think she really wanted to show that race need not be a barrier to open and honest communication.
mm-hmm,
It was good for me because other than the family member who had said blackness is oppression, nothing else matters, I also I was thirsty. I was so hungry to just talk freely about race, free of dogma and slogan words. I
mm-hmm,
really was.
mm-hmm,
So that's how the book came about. And,
oh,
and it's important to note that the book is unique because it's two individuals talking about race.
mm-hmm,
There's no way you could have 40 million Black Americans
mm-hmm,
correspond with 200 million white Americans.
right,
But if you can get people as individuals to dive as deeply as they can into race, you will come close to truth. And there is truth out there. You just have to not be afraid upon its presence, its approach.
well, it's a really intriguing concept, and I'm very much looking forward to reading it. I like the idea of the letters back and forth, so you get to
Mhm.
watch this conversation evolve between two people who are
Yeah,
just trying to honestly grapple with how they
right.
conceptualize these things and each other's experiences and their own experiences.
And total strangers from the get go. I mean, it's one thing to talk with my wife of 30 years about race. She's
Mhm,
heard all the arguments before. She knows all the good, the bad, and the ugly. And with my kids, same ditto.
mhm.
So it was so refreshing to really, in a sense, look at race anew, fresh with a fresh template.
Mhm, and
Yeah.
I go back to the class or the DEI course she was sitting in as you described it, and that she said, "I don't really understand how drawing these out is gonna help the division."
Right.
And it's such a plain common sense statement, and I can also understand the trepidation and the fear she must have felt doing that,
Yes.
and that says a lot about where we are. That just says a lot
Yeah.
about where
And
we
it's
are.
not doesn't say good. It doesn't say much well about where we
No,
are. No,
no.
it's interesting. Do I feel the same trepidation, or as Jennifer might have said, do I enjoy Black privilege because I can talk more freely about race?
Mhm,
Leslie, that's an interesting question we might
mhm,
chew on for a moment. Because at first I felt, well, have the courage of your convictions, write freely.
mhm,
But I noticed as we wrote the book, uh, sometimes she would, I think, hold back or be more diplomatic than maybe
Mm,
she needed to be. I was never that way. I was
mm.
just like, let the cat out of the bag.
Yeah.
I've been living for 60 years. You're going to hear it all.
Yeah.
And so I wonder, did I have greater mental freedom
Mm.
to talk about race because of my race? What do you think?
Hmm. I mean, I think that it's interesting that you raised that, and then you also said a little while ago that if you were sitting here talking with Kendi or somebody else, you would have a different response. So I think that there are probably a lot of factors that contribute to that. You're also a very as a law professor, you're someone who is very well versed in argumentation and has had to learn to be, through
My
your legal
secrets are
studies.
out. My secrets are out.
So so I can imagine that you're very good at crafting an argument that you feel
Yeah.
confident about. So that might be a part of it too. I would hesitate to go straight to race
Okay.
as the
Good.
main
Good.
factor, but
Good.
sure, maybe it could play a role because right now we do have the the cultural conversation does lean very heavily on this white guilt idea, which is shaming
Mm.
white people into not speaking freely about race. So I don't know.
But, but it's interesting because I'm probably what, let's say 22% European in my ancestry. How come I don't feel white guilt in the 22% of my ancestry, which
Mhm.
is European?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a question I'm asking. I mean, is it because once you're black, we can see nothing else? That's a caricature. That's a
Hmm.
stereotype. That's a
Hmm.
cardboard figure. Is it because we don't have the mental sophistication to view individuals
Hmm.
as truly multiracial, even though they may have been assigned the black race at birth?
Hmm. Assigned at birth. Well, and I like how you
I've been
bring it
thinking
back.
about this.
You bring it back down to individualism,
Right, right.
which is I think it's really at the end of the day the only thing that
I
makes
think so.
sense. It's the only
I
way
think
for us
so.
to treat each other
It
like we're
is.
human beings is to look at the
It
individual in front
is.
of us.
So Leslie, why and how did us individuals drop the ball? How did we allow collectivists to kind of take over the conversation? How did that happen? When did that happen? I mean, if you look at our history, people like George Washington, John Adams, Patrick Henry, Tom, we come from individualistic stock.
Mhm.
How did it happen?
Well, I think that there's this bureaucratic management thing that's
Mhm.
happening. I mean, we've got I I- there's I think when we try to administer to large groups of people, you look at how a small school functions versus a big school.
Yeah.
And with a country like the United States, the federal bureaucracy, I think that we need to
Mhm.
manage. There's this idea that we need to have human resources
Mm,
and
mm,
aggregation and the way that I don't have the answers for this, but I have like these broad
mhm,
questions
mhm,
around why are we
mhm.
doing things the way we're doing
Yeah,
them. Hmm.
yeah, yeah. So I think I suspect, I haven't done the work, but I suspect if you were to perform a word cloud analysis
Hmm.
of the leading words used by intellectuals and writers in the 1700s and put that side by side with what writers and intellectuals say today in the 2020s, you're going to find far more respect and love for the individual and
Mm,
human dignity in the 1700s than in this decade, I
yeah.
think. And and isn't that such a strange thing? Because arguably, we should be more respectful of the individual because we have the knowledge of history to look back upon, unlike those who lived in the 1700s. Thomas Jefferson didn't have the benefit of looking at the 1600s or the 1500s or 1400s to find a better way of being
Hmm.
in the world and society, and yet he did it.
Hmm.
So you would think that the great thinkers and minds of our time in this decade would be 3 or 4 steps above Thomas Jefferson, and they're not. I mean, one of the things that so disappoints me is that we seem to have lost the ability to draw upon, revise and edit, and tap into the wisdom of our founding fathers. Love them or hate them,
Hmm.
we have one of the most enduring forms of democratic rule on the globe, on the planet. And that's not something we should forget or toss into the dustbin of history lightly. So, Leslie, you're thinking, but Wink, they were white evil men, they were slave owners, everything they touched turned to dust. Well, no, someone who thinks that lacks discernment. Discernment is like one of those things you learn in elementary school. Things black or white, things are kind of shades of gray. And the same is true for the great wisdom from previous generations. You always want to soak up the best in your past and discard the bad in your past. That leaves you with the best of both worlds. You've enriched yourself with the good, and you've enriched yourself by discarding the bad. Similarly, with Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, and on, we should do this. We should do the same. We should understand that they owned slaves, put that into a box, cast that away as not a good part of their character, and then look at the good things that they did bring into existence, and then build upon that and make life better for our posterity as well.
I think that's very well said. Learning from history and
Yeah,
refining as we go, but not just
history
discarding.
History didn't start with George Floyd in 2020. Sorry, history doesn't start. George Floyd. That's one of my fears, Leslie. My fear is that, like, for me, the great hero of my lifetime might have been Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Will the great hero from my daughter's lifetime be George Floyd? Well, I don't know. Yeah.
Well, that's a metaphor that could be teased out for for a very long conversation.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. So this has been good. I've enjoyed it.
It's been really a great conversation. I'm so glad I got the chance to speak with you. It's not in person, but face to face, whatever this medium is. And where can people find the book if they would like to purchase it?
Oh, sure. Simply go to Amazon.com and type in my first name, Wink, W-I-N-K, Twyman, T as in Thomas, W-Y as in yellow, M as in Mary, A as in Angel, N as in Nancy, and you'll see letters in black and white. I also have a Substack, by the way. If you're really interested in the things I have to say, just type in my first name, Winkfield, Winkfield, Twyman, Twyman, and you'll see my lonely Substack. I just enjoy writing about life and things people don't see so often nowadays. I got about 180 essays, so you can kind of like sample everything I produced and get a sense of how I see life in the world.
Well, great. I'll include links to those underneath of this video so people can follow that.
Good.
And
I think I sent you one. What was it? The Souls of Black Folk?
The Souls of Black Folk. Yes.
Yeah, that's a good one. If you really want to know who I am, and if you want to know where I come from, that's probably the best Substack essay to look at. I'm me. As I wrote a few days ago, there was only one Francis Dumas, who was a great Black political figure in Louisiana. There was only one Governor Pinchback, the first Black governor of Louisiana. And every Black American can say the same thing. There's only one me. And you can live by those words, and you'll be a happier, more fulfilled person. There's only one me.
I think that's
not
beautiful.
A collective.
That's a beautiful reminder. Beautiful. Yeah. Thank you so much for this really enlightening conversation and for a really enjoyable conversation. It really just flew by for me. And I hope we get to talk again in the future.
Well, thank you, Leslie, for tolerating me over this session. But I've enjoyed it. I've had a lot of fun. And I took great inspiration from you. Once again, it's not the ordinary person who can choose to leave law school. So I do appreciate I do appreciate that.
Thank you very much.